Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start recording here. Thank you for being with us today for watching this archived presentation. Today we welcome Dr. Brenda Tufte, who will present the third in a series of 3 online sessions to help graduate students with scholarly writing skills. Dr. Tufte is the Chair of Graduate Education at the University of Mary and a professor in education in the Liffrig Family School of Education and Behavioral Sciences. She holds a PhD in teaching and learning and is published and presented on 21st century learning, differentiated instruction, brain-based learning, and educational leadership. We are so pleased to have you here with us today. So welcome, Dr. Tufte.
Well, thank you all for having me. It's March 1st, 2023. We're in the middle of a snowstorm, but here we are, and many of you have had the opportunity perhaps to look at the 2 other videos that we did on scholarly writing. Those are recorded and available to you. And so our purpose today is to add 5 additional tips to those recordings. And if there are any questions afterward, I'm happy to address them. And I also have my contact information on the front. If you ever had an individual question about your writing, you are more than welcome to reach out to me at the University of Mary. So let me just give you a quick outline. Trying to advance my slides here. Sometimes when we're recording on Zoom, it takes a minute. So I'd like to focus today on helping you to understand that good writing is fluent, cohesive, interesting, evidenced, and analyzed. So those areas I will break down and give you some tips for how to accomplish those important features in your writing, and of course, give you time for questions at the end. Let's start out of combined good writing being fluent and cohesive, because I want you to see the connection between those 2. If you think about if you were going to build a house, if you think about your paper sort of being synonymous to building a house, you wouldn't just sort of start building and kind of build it and plan it as you go. You would definitely plan that in advance. And a paper is really no different, no matter what kind of paper you're doing, whether it's a paper for class on a very specific topic or prompt, or whether it's research writing that you will be doing in your classes, or as you step into the profession, that writing that you're doing in class, that academic scholarly research writing, is the same kind of writing that you would do as a professional. So no matter what kind of writing you do, you really want to take some time at the beginning to think about what your purpose is. If you have a specific prompt or a specific assignment or a specific research question that you are writing to, you really want to focus on that and plan an outline around that, just like you would do if you were building a house. And if you think of all the different rooms of the house, that's very similar to having just different subtopics in your paper, different components, but they all lead back to that overall picture, that overall plan of the house that you want. And so they're all very much connected. We have a purpose for where rooms are in the house and the flow of the house, just like a paper. So definitely begin by identifying a purpose, and then you're going to create that preliminary thesis statement or preliminary research question and begin planning and outlining from that. The next step is so critical, and I think that we sort of think of the next step of reading as something that you do after you've made a final plan for your paper, when in reality you're just creating a preliminary plan to guide your reading, so that you're not reading everything you have, that you can be discriminating and put this source aside because it doesn't align with your purpose or your preliminary research questions or your preliminary thesis or the prompt that you've been given. Or, when you do that search, you have to have some kind of search term that is tightly wound to your purpose and your thesis. If you don't have that, your search becomes almost unmanageable, particularly in today's electronic searching. There's so many options available, and so you really need to narrow that down. But it's in the reading that you begin to really create your final outline and your final thesis statement or your final research questions. It's almost impossible to create your final outline or your final research questions or thesis without having read and having that knowledge to truly understand what direction you want to head in order to address that. So preliminary, do your reading. The preliminary guides your reading, but then the reading leads to the planning as you go. And that way, if you just spend that time at the beginning, you're not going to be floundering, and it truly saves you time moving forward because you're very focused and you know exactly what you want. And part of that outlining is kind of creating those rooms in your house. You're creating those subtopics or those subheadings in your paper. And every subheading needs to lead back to the thesis or the research question. There has to be an alignment or a tight connection. Good writing is interesting. And we often think of scholarly writing and research writing as kind of boring, maybe not all that interesting. It is very formal. You know, we've talked in our past sessions about, you know, using formal diction or formal word choice, not using contractions, not using slang. It is very formal, but and it's also very concise. So when we think of creative type writing that's kind of flowery and descriptive, research writing is not. It's very concise. And in that element, it might seem like then it seems a bit boring because it is so concise, but in some ways that concise, easy reading, pardon me, is just a quality of good writing. If it reads well, it's clear, it's concise, your reading goes more quickly. And so you might be used to having a lot of adjectives or long sentences. When you are creating writing that is interesting and concise, you want to make sure that you go back and look for words that could be excluded. Could you say it in a different way? Sometimes when I get a confusing paragraph from a student where I say, like, this is just really kind of rambling and confusing, I'll say to them, why don't you explain it to me? And they do. And I always say back to them, then why don't you write what you just said? You know what you want to say. And so sometimes with academic writing, we get sort of focused on saying it in a very, you know, using really long words and long sentences, which really isn't what we want to do. We want to say it really clearly and concisely. So understand what it is you want to say and say it in the way that is understandable to you, and that will be understandable to your reader. There is in academic writing, because it's so formal, there is sort of a passive element to it. You're not using first person, so you can't say I think or my interpretation is this. You have to say, you just have to say clearly the evidence leads to this, or it appears that, which is sort of a passive way of writing. So you can't use first person. You need to use third person in your writing. However, even though you're using third person, you want to make that actionable if you can. That's always going to make it a little bit more interesting. And one way to think about making your sentences active and using actionable verbs versus that passive is to think about the use of the TION words. And you can kind of watch for this. This is a really easy way to kind of pick out some more passive sentences in your writing and make them more active. So, you know, when I say TION words, I'm talking about like rationalization, hospitalization, differentiation, those kinds of words. So if you were to say the rationalization for not using ChatGPT was the required demonstration of understanding of information, analysis, evidence, and criticism. That's written in a very passive way, but you could say instead of rationalization, rationalized. Students rationalized that ChatGPT was not helpful when professors required them to demonstrate understanding of information, application, evidence, and criticism. It's just a little bit more interesting, and it's a really easy fix to go from passive to active by turning that TION word into an active form. And I'll give you another example. Hospitalizations occurred at a higher rate when protocols were not followed. Very passive, not quite as interesting. But if you said instead, patients were hospitalized at a higher rate when nurses did not follow protocol, that is a little bit more interesting and a really easy fix for going from passive to active. and just making it a little bit more interesting. And if you think about it, back to my point earlier, that you should say it in the way that you mean it, we probably would use that active form if we were telling it to someone. So in some ways, writing is different than telling or speaking, but in many ways it's not. And it's oftentimes more clear, more concise, and more interesting if we write it in the way that we would say it. And once we get that down, we can kind of formalize and change our word choice a little bit if we want to develop a more formal word. But even when we're doing that, we want to make sure that we're using words that we understand. Let's go into number 4. Research writing and academic writing should be evidenced. And this is critical. This is, for me, the biggest difference between pre-college writing and college writing, especially when you get into your professional courses, and even more so when we get into our graduate courses. So when we talk about evidence, anytime we're presenting an argument or a conclusion, it needs to be supported by evidence. And sometimes we get so hung up on looking for those research studies or those research articles, and that's the only evidence we present. And that's probably, foundational. That's the most important to present. But I want you to think about different ways to present ideas, arguments, conclusions that could be supported by evidence that might even go beyond that. So think about facts that you might present. Those facts might be cited if they're not common knowledge, but sometimes we can kind of connect it to the context of what we're talking about, and just kind of connect it to facts that we all know, maybe reasons why you're making an argument or why a conclusion would make sense. When you present those reasons, possibly presenting examples. And sometimes those examples come from the research that you're using, and sometimes they might come from the field. So it's okay to present examples as part of your evidence. And then, of course, most of our evidence, when we say your writing needs to be evidenced, most of it is going to come from research articles and studies. We might be presenting statistics. And then, of course, all of those need to be cited. And even when you go back to facts, reasons, and examples, if those aren't common knowledge, then they would require a citation. And anything that's statistical or research finding that you get from another source or from another expert, we need to make sure that we're citing. Let's take a look at, take that a little bit further and talk about what it means to analyze. So it's one thing to make sure that your writing is evidenced, but then another to make sure that it's analyzed. And we're taking that a step further because it's one thing to present evidence, whether it's examples or citations or research or statistics, but then we want to take that even further and analyze it. So we don't want to just leave a citation hanging with no analysis or no context as to why that is important to your thesis or your research question. So oftentimes I'll see at the end of a paragraph, there's something that's paraphrased or maybe even directly quoted. And it ends with a citation, which is appropriate, but that's just how the paragraph ends. And we really want to avoid just leaving that hanging citation, especially if it's a direct quote. The rule of thumb with a direct quote, if it's not profound or highly technical, we should paraphrase it. We should always put it in our own words. And that's one of the first steps to making sure that we understand what we're citing. However, sometimes there are some things that are so highly technical that if we try to paraphrase it, it could misconstrue the meaning. Or if it's highly poetic or profound, just that sort of gem of a quote that you don't want to mess with, right? We wouldn't change free at last, thank God Almighty, we're free at last. We'd never put that in our own words. But those are exceptions. Most of what we're taking from the research, the body of research, and the body of literature, sometimes we're looking not just at a research study, but maybe an article that's written by an expert. Most of that should be paraphrased. And so if it's not highly technical and it's not highly profound, we're going to paraphrase it. But with those highly technical or profound quotes, we want to like take it a little bit further and add our analysis and context to it. So rather than just leave that hanging there, we may not even know exactly why you included that. You want to make sure that you interpret the work of others and that you say something about their expertise. And if you think of that expert publication that you've been given, it's like a gift that you have the opportunity to include, but you have to say something about it. You have to take that further. So you want to share your interpretation of that work, and you want to kind of take it to the next level. You want to carry it forward. And so when we talk about, writing being interesting and writing being fluent and cohesive, this analytical part is a big part of that, because we are able to take that new knowledge and we're able to take it forward to the next section of our paper or to some additional conclusions and build upon that. We might connect it to something that was reported earlier, but rather than just leaving it hanging out of context, we can take it farther and share that interpretation and kind of take us to the next section of our paper, or maybe even the next study. And so we talked earlier in our earlier session about transitions. And if there's one I think would be worth repeating from our earlier sessions, it would be that when we're transitioning from one section to the next section, a really good way to do that is to carry that analysis further and then create a transition statement in your next topic sentence. So rather than sort of giving us a fast forward to what's coming ahead, we bring it to a conclusion, we kind of carry it forward, and then we include it in the topic sentence of the next paragraph. So when we go on to the next section, it's still very cohesive and fluent, and it doesn't seem choppy. I think I mentioned already building on the knowledge of that expert, and that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be like your building of it, but you're the one who read the other articles and the other studies and included them earlier, or you are the only one who knows what evidence you're bringing next. And so you're able to build on the knowledge of that one expert by connecting it to what you read from other experts. And in that sense, you are almost creating a new knowledge, which is a part of a meta-analysis, because you have a bigger picture. If you think about it, a research paper is like a mini meta-analysis. You're bringing together a number of studies, and there isn't a researcher in the world that does a meta-analysis and doesn't draw conclusions from it. Our job is not to just repeat what each researcher found. It is to analyze them together and then build on the knowledge of individual studies to create new knowledge and to bring it forward in a new way. So just a couple of reminders. We have to make sure that we're knowledgeable on the subject. And it goes back to the reason why we don't create our final outline and our final thesis until we've done some reading. That's the way that we become an expert on it. And sometimes when we have to defend a capstone or we have to talk about a paper that we wrote, we really are the experts in that content area, or because we created that very unique research paper or evidence-backed paper, and we are familiar with each of the studies. And so it's through that reading and it's through that analysis of each study that we become an expert. And so we become knowledgeable about the subject in a way that we weren't before we did the academic writing. And that's how we continue to move forward as scholar practitioners, is we're constantly reading and learning, and we're making those connections. That's really what critical thinking is. When we're professionals and when we're students, we're thinking critically by making connections to things. So critical thinking isn't just sort of something, a brand new idea that no one has thought of. You know, when we think of innovation, it doesn't have to necessarily be something brand new. It's a way of combining ideas and connecting studies to create new truths that come from that critical thinking and that innovative thinking as we apply the knowledge to our profession. So it's through reading and thinking that we become knowledgeable about the subject, and then we're able to sort of create that meta-analysis that really requires us to zoom out from just the individual studies, but to zoom out from that 10,000-foot view and think about, what do all of these studies together mean? What conclusions can I draw? Where are there inconsistencies and incongruencies? Where are the experts disagreeing? And that can tell us a little bit. If there is disagreement, does it weigh in one way more than another? Are most researchers finding this? So we're starting to kind of weigh the evidence, or is it kind of an even split? Do we really have a true problem of practice where we need to have continued research? Or is the research starting to really weigh? Is the evidence really weighing on one side or another? And we're well equipped when we've gathered all of those individual studies to comment on that. But those connections come only when we sort of force ourselves as thinkers to zoom out from the writing and think about all of the studies and the articles, the gifts that we've been given from those expert writers and expert researchers to try to connect and think about and be critical about. When we do that, I mentioned already, like analyzing the weight of the evidence, and just like a writing tip that I would give you is that when we see that evidence is strongly weighted to one conclusion or sort of one truth, we might use some stronger cues or boosters. So in this first bunch, you can see, the evidence suggests that, or this could be caused by, or the research points to the possibility of. That means there is weight in one area more than another. However, it's not strongly conclusive. But when we see that there is mounting evidence that all of the things that you have presented from experts and from empirical research studies, when we have a strong body of evidence, we can use boosters in our writing to cue that. And then we go back to the other areas that we've been talking about, making it more interesting, making it evidence. When we analyze the evidence, we might add some boosters like clearly there is a need for, or the research shows significant. The evidence is unmistakable. So those booster cues like clearly, significant, evidence, unmistakable, those are cues or boosters, we call them boosters, that can really help the reader to see what you have seen when you zoom out. And you're not going to be able to do that if you don't consider more than one or two or three singular studies. But when you zoom out and look at the evidence that you created from your reading and everything that you've included and cited as your evidence, then your analysis is included in the paper. It's not just a presentation of evidence. It is evidence writing that is analyzed and interpreted by you as a writer. That's the most important point I wanted to make. I have my references, and then I just want to close with some quick, just closing reminders. Let me move my screen here. Remember that reading is vital to you becoming an expert and being able to analyze and interpret and think critically. When you're writing, for those of you for whom writing is very difficult, know that when you write regularly, you really can get through some of those blocks. And just one quick tip I would give you is that when you're writing, don't get too concerned about the structure of the sentence or your word choice. Get your ideas down and then go back and edit for that so that you avoid those writing blocks. I was at a conference for advanced placement writing, and the speaker, it was actually for advanced placement English. And so writing is just a part of an advanced placement English class. And the presenter was just talking about the importance of writing regularly. And one educator shared that, she has her students write on Fridays, that every Friday they spend a significant amount of time writing. But the speaker was advocating for daily writing. And I was so surprised to hear her answer when the speaker asked, is it okay, do you think, for us to focus that on, weekly writing? And she said, if all you're going to do is write weekly, don't even bother. And I was so taken aback by that as an educator. But her point has stuck with me, that the importance of daily writing because what she said is the gains you make when you're writing maybe once a week are lost in the rest of the days when you're not writing. So even if you can put some time aside and write daily, just a little bit. And when we talked about outlines at the beginning, that was our first, to be organized so that you can be concise and fluent and coherent. When you do those headings can be like the little place you visit daily. You go to your heading because you might only have 20 minutes to write that day or 15 minutes to write, and you're not going to get to your entire big paper that you're working on, but you could get to one of your subheadings. And so by creating the outline, it allows you to visit it daily. The next really quick tip I would give you is to take a break after writing and then come back and edit, which it'll require you to not write at the last minute, but you'll be amazed at what you see when you have had a chance for your mind to kind of rest and then refocus. And then just the importance of being critical in your thinking. So you're not just reporting, you are analyzing. And so you have to think critically. And when you're reading, you don't want to just highlight what you plan to report in your paper from that source. You want to annotate that source. You want to underline anything and put a question mark if you don't understand it. You want to put that star or that exclamation mark beside something you see as being vitally important, and then maybe even an arrow that connects to something you read earlier, or an idea that you have, or a theory of practice that you want to connect it to. And when you do that annotation while you're reading, the analytical part is much easier because you're not just like, okay, I finished my writing, now I'm going to analyze it. You've been analyzing it the whole time, and you're about to share your analysis. And you can certainly embed your analysis as you report, or you can report more deeply at the end, or ideally do both. Anytime you have a citation, you should be writing at least 2 to 3 sentences about it. So you're certainly going to embed it, and then you're going to go back to that analysis in a more holistic sense in the end. Revision is an important part of it. We know that. And so do that in stages and make sure that you explain your ideas to someone, or even to yourself. Maybe you're talking to yourself and you're explaining your ideas, or you're explaining your interpretation. And I gave you the example of a student, telling me what they meant by this paragraph, but it's not at all what they wrote. So when you explain it, that processing leads to understanding. And then lastly, I would tell you that when you read feedback from your professors, you should explain it to yourself. You should interpret it. What does that mean to me? And if you can't do that, it's really vital that you reach out to the professor to get clarity on that. And sometimes on an assignment, I'll even have students, when the feedback on a specific part of their writing is important, I'll tell them to send a note back to me that explains what I said, that demonstrates their understanding of what feedback I gave them. And that way I know they're reading their feedback. It's really vital. And then they're explaining it, because what we know from research is if we wait too long between when we as learners read the feedback and then get back to it and actually change it, that learning can be lost in between there. So that quick activity of just explaining it to yourself, to kind of paraphrase what you're being asked to do in that feedback and making sure you can do it, will help it stick, so that the next time you write, that's something you've overcome. You're not making that same mistake again. All right, that wraps up our 5 new tips that we're adding to our arsenal of writing strategies. And if anyone had any questions at this point, I'd be happy to answer them. And I'm also happy to just answer any emails if any come forward after watching the recording.
Thank you so much. That was extremely, extremely interesting and will be wonderfully beneficial to our students. I know that a group of our students are just embarking on their DMP project, and they've submitted 1 paper so far, and just so many of the tips that you gave will be extremely useful for them as we are giving them feedback. So I really, really appreciate it. Does anybody that's here have questions? I do have one question, but I'll save mine till the end.
Sure.
Maybe nobody has a question. So I think you've probably addressed this before, but it's a problem that I continue to see, and honestly, one that I get lost in myself. I can talk myself one way or the other, but it's the use of past tense and, well, variable tenses, I guess. You know, if you're talking, let's say, in a literature review and you're explaining literature that's already been published, obviously that's in the past tense, but is it okay to have past and future tenses in a single paragraph?
That's a great question. You certainly could see it in a single paragraph, but where you don't want to see it is in a sentence. And you're absolutely right. When we're reporting on research that's been published, or even just something that an expert said, they said it in the past. We have the exact year that they said it, and so we cite in past tense. So it's stated, noted, promoted, emphasized. Those are always past tense in those citations. And if you remember in an earlier video, we talked about embedding citations and using those past tense verbs rather than always having just the parenthetical citation at the end. It just gives some nice variety. But when we do that, and we need to do that if we're using APA, then within that sentence, it should stay with that consistent past tense. Where it could change tense then is when we take that information and apply it to the current field or even apply it to the future. So we wouldn't necessarily say, you know, these findings should be considered by are considered or were considered by researchers or by practitioners. We might say practitioners would be wise to consider these factors in their practice, because then we moved from past tense reporting to present tense application of it.
Perfect. Right. Yes. Thank you so much. That's excellent. Anybody else have questions?
No questions, Dr. Tufte. Just thank you so much. I agree with Deb as we embark on this new journey with our D&P students with their project work. This is going to be so helpful for us. Thank you.
My pleasure, and thanks for offering this to your students. I think it's wonderful to kind of bring in other perspectives on writing and just supplement that focus on communicating our learning. It's so important.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, and stay warm today.
You as well. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.